All right, are we going to start? Are you all right? All right, so good evening, everybody, and welcome to our keynote speaker. So today, it's this evening in Dubai, but it's morning in San Diego. We have Catherine Mattice, and she is going to be our keynote speaker for today. Now, Catherine is a practitioner. She is an expert in the area of building HR partnerships and positive partnerships with organizations. And so she is going to talk to us about this today, and I'm sure we're going to learn a lot. So I'm absolutely delighted to hand over to you, Catherine Mattice.
Thank you so much. Well, just to tell you a little bit about me, thanks for that introduction, Allison. And I have to say, I'm really honored to speak with you all today. Back in graduate school, of course, there are many of you whose names I was reading as I was writing all of my papers on workplace bullying. And I came to the conference in Montreal in 2009, sort of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, fresh out of grad school, and now here I am delivering a keynote. So it's really cool to be able to share my knowledge with all of you. I got interested in workplace bullying, like many of us, because I went through an experience. I was the director of human resources for an organization, and there was one individual who was engaging in bullying behavior. And he was also a director, so we were peers. And I was really hurt and bothered by the way he treated me and others. So I was experiencing this as a target, but I was also experiencing it as the director of HR and dealing with all of the organizational problems that he was creating. And so I started graduate school. I had a class called The Dark Side of Communication here at San Diego State with Dr. Spitzberg. And of course, had to write a paper on something dark. And it was then that I discovered workplace bullying and all of you and all of the research and found that very therapeutic. So I ended up doing all of my graduate research on bullying. Every course that I had, I wrote a paper on workplace bullying, wrote my thesis on bullying, and then got out of graduate school and decided this is a problem and I think I might know how to fix it. And so I'm going to start a business. So I started Civility Partners, and I now have a team of wonderful consultants and helpers, and together we really use the HR, we use the lens of HR as we build positive workplaces with our clients. So I'm just going to tell you the stuff that I know about workplace bullying from a practitioner's point of view, and tell you some of the places where I see, what I've read in the research doesn't necessarily match my own experiences. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And of course, I'm not going to define workplace bullying as you've all defined it in the academic literature. Instead, I'm going to talk with you about how I define workplace bullying for employers, because it's a different scenario to talk to employers about bullying and what it is and how to solve it. So we'll just kind of go through some different things that I've learned along the way, and then I'll share a few case studies with you. So when I'm defining bullying for employers, and a lot of times I am out delivering speeches at human resources conferences, that is a big way that I've built Civility Partners in my business. And so there are lots of HR professionals out there who do want to solve workplace bullying. And so I always have a pretty big audience when I'm speaking at conferences about bullying. So the way that I define bullying in those speeches, as well as when I'm delivering any sort of harassment prevention training or any training around building a positive work environment, we really lean on this spectrum. And, we talk it through with our clients that, if you have this lower end type of behavior like incivility, unprofessionalism, microaggressions, these behaviors that are seemingly minor, right? We're not managing them. There aren't policies against incivility. We don't want to micromanage employees. We're all entitled to having a bad day. But if we don't solve those types of behaviors, or if we're not paying attention, then of course the behavior can escalate into bullying. And I also have conflict in there in that, certainly conflict can include incivility and unprofessionalism, but it can certainly escalate into workplace bullying if it goes unresolved. So for example, one client that I was working with, there were two women, one was the manager, one was a subordinate, and they had been in conflict for quite a while, and the organization did what many do and said, you two can figure it out, you're adults. And over time it escalated, and one was a person of color, so she started claiming harassment, and the other was claiming workplace bullying. She was Caucasian. So their conflict had really escalated to where they were both calling each other a bully or a harasser, essentially. So one place that I really vary from the law, and also probably where I vary from many of you in terms of how I'm defining bullying and harassment in their relationship, is that I like to say that workplace bullying, or abusive conduct, as they call it here in California, where I am, that abusive conduct is an overarching phrase that is any sort of abuse at work. But then if you aim that behavior at a protected characteristic, then that's when we call it harassment. I started doing that because I would hear a lot of times HR say things like, bullying doesn't rise to the level of harassment, as in bullying is a lower level version of harassment. And as we know, that's not true. Bullying is quite harmful. And so this was my attempt at shifting that and getting everyone, employers, to see that bullying and harassment should be treated the same in terms of how they're resolved, the damage they cause, and all of that. So I'm saying there's this overarching abusive conduct, there's a category around harassment and discrimination, and then there's this other category of group bullying, mobbing and hazing. So just to point out another way that harassment and bullying are related in terms of how I'm describing this to employers, is that, so this is from the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That is the federal government agency that manages harassment complaints. So they define harassment as a form of discrimination. It's unwelcome conduct based on protected characteristics. The harassment becomes unlawful where enduring the conduct feels like a condition of employment, and or where the conduct is so severe or pervasive that a reasonable person would consider it intimidating, hostile, or abusive. So I always show this slide when I'm delivering presentations to HR to point out that everything in that pink box actually describes workplace bullying as well, that someone who feels bullied certainly feels like it's a condition of employment, and they certainly feel like it's intimidating, hostile, or abusive. So I'm always working with employers and working with HR in making a business case to leaders for solving bullying, to say, hey, one way you could talk to your leader about solving bullying is to let them know that, hey, it's exactly like harassment. All that needs to happen is someone has to figure out that they're in some sort of protected characteristic. So try to give them that conversation to have with leaders. So I always describe workplace bullying as occurring in 3 different buckets. The first bucket is aggressive communication, like this guy here on the screen. And I've certainly, I engage in coaching executives who engage in workplace bullying, and have definitely heard of this type of behavior when I'm doing my 360 interviews. The second category is humiliation. So doing things like, leaving people out or pointing out mistakes in public, etc. And then the third bucket is, of course, manipulation or sabotage, doing things like giving someone so much work they can't possibly complete it, and so on and so forth. So I had created these buckets just through looking at all of the different surveys that researchers use. And then, maybe it was just sort of in my mind, I started to notice too that here in the state of California, where we do have a law that requires abusive conduct be discussed in our mandatory harassment prevention training, that those three buckets show up in the state of California's law and how California defines abusive conduct. And you can also see those three buckets in the federal law. The three buckets are important because a lot of times you see just big, long lists of bullying behavior. When I look at anti-bullying policies, corporate policies, a lot of times that's what I see, just a long list of things that could count as bullying. I think the three buckets is a great way to describe the behavior to employers because it makes it fairly simple. And whenever I give presentations to HR and I show these three buckets, I always say any bullying behavior that you've ever experienced or know about will absolutely fall in one of those three buckets. And a lot of times people raise their hand and try to challenge me on that. Well, what about this kind of behavior? And it always falls in one of those three buckets. So just wanted to say too, if you have questions or comments or things you want to say, I would love to chat with you. So please do ask questions along the way and all of that. All right. So something else I wanted to make sure I addressed today was, this idea of intent or malice. So I know that the research has been kind of back and forth, and there's a lot of conversation there around intent. And here in the United States, we have a few laws related to workplace bullying, or abusive conduct is the phrase that seems to be used in the law here in the States. So Puerto Rico is the only place that has an actual law prohibiting abusive conduct. And that's recent. That just passed last year, I believe. California, we have our law, where we have to talk about abusive conduct in our harassment prevention training, but it doesn't actually prohibit abusive conduct. So both California and Puerto Rico include the word malice in the definition. And so that means that either the behavior is intentional or it's a gross disregard for humans, essentially. And then Nevada, Tennessee, and Utah also have laws around abusive conduct. Tennessee and Utah do not prohibit bullying. They require training, and Utah requires training. Tennessee basically says if you have a policy against bullying, the employer won't be liable. And then in Nevada, that is another place where abusive conduct is prohibited. If you work in the school system in Nevada, you are protected from abusive conduct at work. But those three states do not include the word malice. So I just think that's interesting that this is still a conversation we're having, especially if you look at harassment law here in the United States. The law specifically states whether the behavior is intentional or not, it's illegal behavior and it's a problem. And so I always, when I'm delivering harassment prevention training, I a lot of times compare harassment to stealing. And I'll say, look, stealing is illegal. And if you saw somebody stealing from your organization, it's a lot easier to say, okay, that's wrong, that there's a clear line that you've crossed, that's illegal, I'm gonna report you. Well, harassment is also illegal behavior. So when you're aware of harassment, you should have that same thought process that, hey, that's illegal behavior, you've crossed the line, I'm gonna report it. And of course, there's a lot of reasons people don't, but I don't know, just something to think about, that maybe it doesn't even matter if it's intentional or not. If it happens, it's harmful and it needs to be addressed. And I'll be talking a little bit later about individuals that I've coached along the way. And I have found that most of the time it's not intentional, that these individuals have just really lost their way on good management and good leadership. So those are my thoughts on intent. So just to kind of highlight that, one individual that I coached, his name was Joe. And Joe, the first time I met him, he was pretty appalled that he had ended up in this coaching situation. And like many of the people that I coach, he had been acting this way for quite a while. And in fact, his manager, when I interviewed his manager, was actually crying because he was so upset at the damage Joe had caused on his watch. And he couldn't figure out how to get Joe to stop. And he had been trying to work with Joe to get Joe to change. So Joe finally crossed the line, and coaching, they decided he needed coaching, and I was brought in. So when I met with Joe, he was really hurt. He's telling me, I don't understand why they let my behavior get so out of hand. And now all of a sudden I'm in this position where if I don't change, then I'm going to be fired. And so he was hurt by that. And the interesting thing was that he had been told, and his manager had been working with him, and HR had been stepping in. It was just that the way the information was being delivered to him wasn't working for him. He wasn't taking it in. And that's because he lacked social and emotional intelligence. Art's another individual that I coached, and ironically, he was bullying out of love for the organization. I'm not making excuses for him, of course, but he was the CTO of a Fortune 5,000 company. He was employee number 8 at this organization that had grown over the years. And this organization created software that sits behind Google Maps and maps that are in the satellites. And there's some sort of software that goes behind that. And that's what this organization did. And so Art would come up with these ideas. He had all these different teams that he would work with to execute the ideas. And then he would, those ideas would be sold for millions of dollars. And so he was kind of the golden goose at the organization. And his boss, the CEO, would tell him, you're responsible for 5,000 paychecks. And so he felt like there was no room for error. So when people made mistakes, it caused him great anxiety, not because he hated everyone or was a narcissist or a psychopath or any of these things. He just wanted to make sure that he was making sure everybody had, food on the table. So at the far end of the spectrum then is violence, and workplace violence and bullying is another conversation that I have with employers and with HR to help them kind of make that business case for solving bullying. So if you think about this guy, certainly that's workplace violence. If somebody feels afraid, that's workplace violence. So OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and then we have the federal government that manages that. OSHA is the federal body. They describe violence as any act or threat of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening, disruptive behavior that occurs at the work site. And it ranges from threats and verbal abuse to physical assaults and homicide. So this seems to resonate with employers too, that, hey, just because they're not punching someone, it doesn't mean that it's not violence. So just another way to kind of make a business case for employers. And that's what I often find myself doing is, it's not enough to say people in your organization are unhappy and they're disengaged and they're hurt and they feel abused. You've got to fix it. That unfortunately doesn't often turn the tide. It has to be you're running the risk of liability, that this is costing you, and so on and so forth. So one piece of advice I see a lot out there in the world is that it seems like we're often talking about policy and training as if that's going to change the organization's culture. And I was really appalled during the Me Too movement a few years ago when all the advice I was seeing in mainstream, high level Forbes and Inc. magazine and these types of well-respected venues, this seemed to be the advice that, well, you should have your anti-bullying policy or anti-harassment policy and make sure you're doing harassment prevention training. And that advice was being doled out as if that was going to solve the Me Too issue. And that was really frustrating for me. What I find is that when we focus on policy and training, that it's all very focused on the law and the legalities. And so even here in California, where we have mandatory harassment prevention training, if you have 5 employees or more, you have to deliver harassment prevention training every 2 years. And because the California legislatures are the ones who created the training in terms of the learning objectives. So they have all of these wickets that you have to hit in order for the training to be compliant. But the training then is so focused on the law that it's not really that useful. And HR and organizations, employers have come to a place where harassment prevention training is simply meant to, they tick a box. And so, for example, one client I was talking to, or potential client, was talking about doing their harassment prevention training online, so that people could take it at their own leisure and pace. That, hey, we're going to put it as part of the onboarding process so that we can just make sure it's done. Here in California, it has to be completed within 6 months of hire. And so when you think about how harassment prevention training has evolved into just ticking the box and saying you're compliant, that it really loses its ability to be impactful and deliver a lot of great information. And so what I would say to employers like that is like, hey, if you do harassment prevention training on day 3 of their, working for you, and you have not yet talked about your organization's culture, your company core values, how serious you take harassment, then all you are doing is checking the box. And the message is that harassment's not really that important. So I try to get employers to see that how you deliver harassment prevention training, the messaging around the harassment prevention training, all of that is really important. And so we really have to see training differently. And in fact, just this year, we finished up a good, it was probably 8 months that we trained 600 people virtually over Zoom in lots of 30 people at a time. And they had done their compliant harassment prevention training. And what they asked me for was a harassment prevention training 2.0. So like, okay, we did that. It actually didn't work. They had a big Me Too moment in June of 2020 where lots of people came forward. It was in the news. This is a global gaming company. And, it was like, okay, clearly that other version didn't work. We want you to actually talk about useful stuff, the people stuff. So instead of talking about training and policy, we really have to talk about leadership. And that's not just the people at the top. Anybody who has the ability to influence, is a leader. And certainly policy matters, but the organization has to follow the policy and then the organizational behavior. So the behavior of the organization itself and the behavior of the individuals there. So all of those things will really create culture. So just these are the 3 areas we focus on when we're consulting and working with clients. So something else I want to share with you today is what I've learned about human resources. And you have to remember that I came from a place where I was the director of HR and I couldn't solve the bullying. The person engaging it was another director, so he was my peer. I had no power over him. And the president of the organization, whom we both reported to, was very conflict avoidant, or kind of a weak leader, as I've seen it in the research. I always love to say that when I'm speaking at HR conferences. The technical term is weak leadership. That he wasn't willing to address it. So I spent a lot of time in the president's office asking him for help to address this person's behavior. And he would say things like, well, that's just how he is. Don't let it bother you. Be the bigger person. And that was part of what drove my engagement down. I worked there for 5 years, and over time I was not performing, or I was performing less and less and less. And it was just like, why do I have to take the brunt of this? Why can't you just talk to him? So in that new edition of the handbook that came out, Salen has an article in there where she's talking about the perspectives of HR, what targets think about HR. And these are the types of things that we're hearing. Targets certainly feel like they go to HR. HR either makes it worse or doesn't do anything, or kind of tries to talk them out of it. Are you sure it's bullying? It's not that bad. I do hear from HR, they get frustrated when people use the phrase a hostile work environment, because that's attached to harassment, that's illegal. And, they're like, well, it's not actually a hostile work environment, it's not harassment. But I always tell them, well, if it feels hostile to them, then it's a hostile work environment, technical terms aside. What I find, though, is that when I'm speaking to human resources, they are dying for help and feel very lost. And so HR is not, HR can't solve problems unless their leader gives them permission to. So, HR is still working for a seat at the table, as they say. Not a lot of organizations have a chief human resources officer or CHRO. If an organization has a CHRO, that means the CEO sees HR as important enough that they belong in the C-suite, the executive suite. But most organizations don't have a CHRO. And so, I've been in this position where people were coming to me and I couldn't help them. So I was probably seen as this, but that's because people assumed I could solve their problem. But without the leader telling me I could solve the problem and giving me permission, I wasn't able to solve it. So I just, HR is the collector of all of this information and data from employees. And then HR can take that to the leader and say, here's a problem that I'm hearing about and we need to solve it. But unless the leader is willing to spend resources on that problem, HR can't solve it. And of course, HR can't go back to the complaint and the person who complained and say, well, the leader says I can't solve it, sorry. So the employees have no idea what HR is going through. And so we just have to be careful about blaming HR. And I just see it all the time. I'm in a million Facebook groups of targets, who are in there talking to each other. And of course, they're talking about this stuff, that HR didn't help them. Don't you dare go to HR is the advice they give. They'll just make it worse. But HR really wants to help. They just often don't have the ability. So what often happens in my case is people come to me when something big has happened. So a lot of the time, the behavior has been festering for a long time, or the culture has been going down the wrong path for some time. HR has been aware of it, but until the CEO gets slapped in the face, HR doesn't have permission to solve it. So by the time they call me, they're telling me, oh my gosh, this person's been acting this way forever. I've tried this, I've done that, it doesn't work. Now we're ready to hire someone for help. So managers also need more attention. That middle management definitely has the ability to really affect change, and we're just not empowering them enough. So I don't know about where you are, but I find here in the United States, managers are, left to fend for themselves. They know that they're supposed to manage performance, but they don't really know how to manage behavior. And so, for example, when I am doing manager training or leadership training around harassment prevention or anti-bullying, or creating a positive work environment, we talk about risk factors, things that the organization is doing or not doing that actually facilitates the ability for bad behavior to occur. So, I think this is something else we have to think more about too, that if we're aware of all of these risk factors or antecedents to workplace bullying, then we have to provide training and guidance and consulting to organizations about removing or minimizing those antecedents as much as possible. So, for example, when I'm doing training for a supervisor level and we're talking about risk factors, they can affect change in all of these areas. But number 9, a high stress environment, certainly that creates opportunities for bullying because people are feeling aggressive when they're stressed out. So then we talk with supervisors about how can you make some positive change, at least in that little realm? Are there things that you can do to minimize stress or alleviate stress, even just a little bit, so that you're minimizing the opportunity for bad behavior to happen? If your organization is lacking diversity, how can you affect change and influence the organization in that way? What kind of conversations can you have with your C-suite? So it's all about taking that personal responsibility for the organization's culture and, trying to influence it in all the ways they can. And even if they're not a CEO who has resources and the power to, make things happen, managers and supervisors can make things happen in their own teams. So whatever's going on in the culture, at least in their own team, they can try to do their best to make it as positive as they can. And so, when we're investigating bullying and harassment, investigations are really focused on the facts, who did what and when and who saw, and an investigation is all about proving or disproving whether or not this occurred. But we're missing the bigger picture when we do investigations. So certainly we have to do them in most countries. That's part of the requirement that the organization needs to do that. But we're missing, where did the manager go wrong? And did the manager go wrong because they weren't trained on how to address this problem early on? So we do a lot of training for managers and supervisors on, here I'll give you some of our learning objectives. The nuances of bad behavior, talking to them about incivility, and hey, if you can address that, then it makes it easier than if you're addressing bullying. That's a lot harder to address. How do you help your employees navigate conflict? How do you coach behavior? It's not just coaching performance, it's coaching behavior. So really giving managers and supervisors a lot of tools for addressing the people problems. So I have a couple questions here. I'll go ahead and answer. So one is HR really that helpless? What influence can they affect in their sphere of influence? That's a great question. So yes, in my experience, HR is quite helpless because unless their employer is willing to provide the time and the resources and the money to make real change, HR can't make real change. That said, I often joke that HR has to be an HR ninja. And one way they might be able to influence change is to say, hey, CEO, here's some best practices in the world of performance management. And so I'm going to tweak our performance management system to, meet these best practices. And then they can include things like, managing or measuring people on their ability to communicate well or build a team environment. So absolutely, HR has the ability to influence things through their HR processes. But if you have a leader or a VP or somebody the CEO sees as really valuable, it's hard to get CEO permission to fully address that person's behavior. But yeah, there's a lot of HR processes to do. I got a couple of questions about the risk factor. What makes high intelligence staff a risk factor? So I have noticed that, so for example, in universities, you have a lot of individuals who have PhDs. Their lot in life is to take a position and, argue that in the research papers that they're writing. So that's an example of where highly intelligent staff can actually, of course, we want highly intelligent staff, but given the nature of their role, highly intelligent people are paid for what's in their mind. So if you have a bunch of people who feel that they're right, then that can create conflict and an opportunity for bullying. Also, lawyers is another example of where you see a lot of workplace bullying and harassment. Another question, in other countries, workplace bullying is sometimes included in occupational health and safety laws. Do you see a role for OHS professionals with bullying? Absolutely, absolutely. So here in the States, we have OSHA, our occupational safety and health laws. And while OSHA talks about things like verbal abuse and threats as a form of violence, because that's where OSHA is focused, they're focused on violence. OSHA's got a ways to go here in the States before it starts, it's got to be talking about psychological safety. And of course, if people don't feel psychologically safe, they're distracted. If they're working in a manufacturing plant, they can hurt themselves if they're distracted, and so on and so forth. So absolutely, I do see a role for occupational health and safety professionals. Absolutely. Okay. If HR is helpless, what can employees do to get help with a situation? So that's the conundrum, right? So if an employee goes to HR and says, this is what I'm experiencing, and HR says, okay, let me try to help you. And maybe HR does an investigation and figures out that it's not harassment technically, because it's not about a protected characteristic. Instead, it's just bullying, I say with air quotes. Then they find it difficult to get permission to really dive in there and solve it, unless the CEO is interested in how people feel. So employees, then they're kind of in this scenario where, you know, HR is not really helping them. And again, HR is certainly not going to come back and say, well, the leader said I can't help you, sorry. So HR is trying to be the buffer. You know, employees really have to stand up for themselves and each other. Okay, so practitioner roles in solving workplace bullying. So the wonderful and amazing Eva Mickelson and I started a paper a long time ago, actually, Eva. I was just looking at that last night, seeing that we started that in 2017, I think. So a couple things that we're working on. One day we'll publish a paper that balancing employer needs and budget is something practitioners face. So for example, I've had clients, potential clients, call me and say, we have a couple people who engage in bullying. Could you do a training for the whole organization? And maybe that person or those couple people will figure it out, and they'll know that it's about them, and maybe they'll change, you know. And my answer is generally no. I will not do that for you, because it's a waste of time and money. And in fact, it's probably going to make people even more annoyed, because they're all going to know that they're sitting in an anti-bullying training because of the 3 people in the back who aren't paying attention anyway. So you probably don't want to go that route. You know, so I do get people calling who say, I want to solve this problem. We only have so much money, you know, so I won't take on clients where I feel like it's going to either make it worse or, you know, it's just not going to make change. I don't want them to spend money on things like that. I'd rather sort of coach HR from the background and give them some free advice to try to help them. So I won't take on clients unless I know there's some level of, you know, some sort of positive influence that's going to come from that work. And really it's a consultant's job or a practitioner's job to teach clients the things they need to know, so that they can, once they know things, then they can continue to, you know, create a positive work environment all on their own. And practitioners have a lot of roles that we're filling simultaneously. We have to be a role model. You know, we certainly have to engage in positive, respectful behavior at all times, if that's what we're saying the organizations need to have. I do find I have to be a salesperson. I have to sell that there's a problem. I have to sell that it's costing money. I have to sell the different solutions that I'm offering and why those are the right solutions. You know, so we're educators and experts, we're counselors and coaches. We have to be a detective and try to uncover what's going on. Sometimes the organization wants us to be the hired gun, you know, hey, can you resolve this problem for us, you know, and just make it happen, and then it'll go away, you know. And of course that's not how it works. It's not how being a practitioner works. And so we have all of these different hats that we're wearing, and it can be taxing. We here at Civility Partners, we cry, we laugh, we get emotional when we're interviewing. And as I'm sure many of you, when you're interviewing targets, that it can be very emotionally taxing. And sometimes I find myself as the scapegoat, where something, maybe an employee is unhappy with the change and somehow it's my fault, you know, that this is the way they're feeling. So I see some other questions coming through, so I'm gonna keep going through, and then I'll start to get to those to the end, because I know that we've only got about 15 minutes left. So here is one case study. So this was an organization that was it was a university, a big, well-known university here in California, and their IT department had a big Me Too moment. So they had, during the height of Me Too a few years ago, they had 5 women came forward and claimed that they were being discriminated against and bullied and harassed. And, you know, it's IT, so it's mostly male. They're definitely the minority, and it's mostly white male. And so this wasn't surprising that this is how these women were feeling, to me anyways. And so they wrote a blog in a, I guess, kind of famous blog in the IT world. And so it was getting some attention. And so kudos to those women, because they had actually reported their problems to HR and nothing was happening. And in fact, the investigation for one woman took over a year, which is sickening to me. It makes my stomach turn to think that that's what HR was doing. But so kudos to them, because it was trying to get swept under the rug. And by calling it out publicly, the organization said, uh-oh, well, now we've got to do something, because we've got to be able to, you know, publish a press release that we did something. So they cornered this organization into solving it. So the first thing we did was conduct an assessment. And the organization was quite top heavy. And so we interviewed all of the directors and leaders in order to understand what they wanted to know, how they thought we had gotten here with this problem, what problems did they have? And then through that, we can glean, you know, what do we want to know? So we put together a rather lengthy survey. Usually we try to keep our employee surveys at 50 questions or below. This one, because there were so many problems, it got kind of long, but we pulled measures from the academic research. I didn't have time to pull all of that for you, but if you're interested in the survey measures that we used, I'm happy to, you can email me and I'm happy to send that to you. And so this is what we were rating. And we ended up with, I think it was about 80 questions, which is long. We also interviewed 10% of the workforce. And so there were about 300 people. So we interviewed 30 people. And some of the open-ended questions we asked were just kind of, tell me what it's like to work here. Would you feel comfortable reporting bad behavior, et cetera? And interestingly enough, people really, really, really respected each other. That came through loud and clear, which I was a little surprised by. However, lots of areas for improvement. Mainly, there was not enough transparency. People didn't feel heard. Stuff went up into the cloud and they didn't know what happened to their ideas, and they just needed a more inclusive work culture. So one thing we found in the data was that the Black workforce saw the organization quite differently than the rest of the workforce. So these are all of our different measures. We were measuring, harassment based on ethnicity and gender and bullying and strategies that leadership was engaging in to build relationships, the perception of commitment to diversity, and then engagement and job satisfaction. And so the Black workforce saw the organization quite different. We also found that women were experiencing bullying on a weekly basis. So their responses were quite different in that category. And then of course, that also drove down their engagement and job satisfaction, et cetera. So what do we do with that information now that we have this data? So what we do is work with what we call an action team. And so we pull together a group of employees, managers, supervisors, leaders. And so we try to come up with an action team that's diverse, that represents the entire organization, that we did a process of asking, who do you recommend? Kind of like, who are the natural leaders that we should bring on the team, but also we put out a little application and people could fill it out, and then we selected from that application the remaining group. We had 13 people total at this organization. I learned that was too much. I wouldn't go higher than 8 now, but at the time we did 13, it was just too many people. And what we do is facilitate a series of strategic planning meetings so that we can create a strategic plan. This is an example from a different client where you can see it's just like, and this is a 12-month plan. So what I do is work with an action team to create a 6-month plan so that we can say, let's get some high impact stuff done right now. And then we can create a 12-month plan after that. And that's where I'll start to really teach you how to manage your culture. So it's little by little, what are the little action items that we can take? At this particular organization, I think we had 5 objectives total. And then within each objective, we had 2 or 3 goals that we were trying to meet within the 6 months. And so here are some examples of some of those objectives and goals. So we ended up with a very long list of things to do, just to give you some examples of what those action items were. One was that we created, so that the university had core values, and we worked with their internal HR person there inside IT to create a competency matrix so that everyone was now being measured on their ability to live the university's core values. And we started by rolling that out to the directors, and then it got rolled out to the managers, and then it got rolled out to the employees. So this way we could hold people accountable to the right kind of behavior. We wanted to invite in the 300 employees as much as we possibly could. So some of the ways we did that was to crowdsource a list of job boards. Where do you know that we could be looking for new employees when things open up, or when we have a job posting, so that we can make sure we're getting a more diverse population? And what kinds of interview questions do you think should be asked in interviews so that we can make sure people know how to be inclusive? A big thing was more transparency. So the CIO, Chief Information Officer, started doing coffee. So he would go to each of the departments monthly and bring coffee and donuts, and you could just come if you wanted and ask him pointed questions. They started doing all staff meetings, which they weren't doing. And this item in bold, frequent skip level meetings with directors and employees. I put that in bold because it's the cheapest way to impact culture, and it was the most impactful thing that the organization did. So when we did our pulse survey, that really came through as something that made a huge difference. So all that the directors needed to do was stop being so hierarchical and just start building relationships down below, management by walking around, as they say, and that was hugely impactful. And then I was working with the leadership team to kind of coach and guide them. One of the problems there was that the CIO was just sort of ignorant in how to talk about culture and how to take responsibility for where the culture had gone. And I remember in the town hall meeting when I presented the assessment results the first time around, the leader gets up and he says something like, "This isn't the organization I thought I was leading. How could you?" Kind of like, "How could you behave that way? Shame on you all." And he wasn't taking responsibility. So I actually hired a PR professional who handles crisis communication. And he gave this leader some coaching on how to talk about a crisis and taking responsibility. We also, of course, often some of the action items that we're engaging in through this strategic plan is to provide training. I do think that there's a lot of important training that all organizations should be doing. Managers, again, really have to be good at coaching behavior and performance. And everyone's got to be good at interpersonal skills. Those are essential skills, and allyship and assertiveness. And so we did do we called it from bystander to ally training. And 41% of our survey respondents, when we did a pulse survey, indicated that they had used something they had learned in that training, which was awesome. A lot of people said they, hadn't had a need to use it, but I thought 41% was pretty cool. Also, one of the members of my action team decided to carry that training forward, and she created something called I've Got Your Back. And so she really took ownership of this, and she started holding lunch and learns once a month where she would create scenarios and send them to me so I could help her craft them. And then people could show up at this lunch and learn, and she would share these scenarios, and then the group could talk about what's the right action, what could you do, how could you solve this or influence it. And so she really carried this forward, that I'm not going to allow this allyship thing to just filter into the distance. I'm going to make sure that people really feel comfortable and knowledgeable to help each other out. So in that way, there was like some social pressure to be an ally. And then of course we evaluate our work. So we do pull surveys, etc. And so we were pretty excited about this. 55% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that they'd seen improvement within that first year that we'd been working. And then also super proud of these charts. The Black workforce started to see the organization differently. And in fact, their director, so the way this worked was the Black workforce was mostly in one specific department. And the leader of that department had been let go, and they brought in a new director. And to his credit, a lot of that change in the line there is him. He really got in there and wanted his workforce to, he wanted to hear them and help them and make sure they felt valued. So that, you know, again, it's just that leadership relationship really made a big difference. And then we were able to smooth out the line on our chart when it comes to females and really quickly resolved bullying. So I'm going to share one other quick case study with you. And this is all, you all know Dr. Laura Crawshaw, and I am a certified boss whisperer. I definitely use her coaching methodology. And, so just wanted to touch on that and share that there's been some success there as well. I want to leave a couple minutes for questions. So Dr. Crawshaw talks about the fact that people engage in workplace bullying because they're really focused on competence. And I find that to be true. Absolutely. That there is a fear of mistakes and that things aren't going to go right. And so they're hyper anxious around competence. And couple that with the fact that they lack empathy, they don't understand the impact of their behavior. And so I've added a third item in there, that one thing I've noticed, a theme, is that these individuals have been fighting for something their whole lives. So for example, I coached a doctor who was a single mom, and she was the only woman in medical school, add that she was a single mom. So she'd been fighting to be seen her whole life, her whole career. I coached a woman who was from China, who came to America speaking no English, and she moved all the way up to having a PhD and running a pharmaceutical company. So one guy was from the south side of Chicago, which is known for being not that great, part of town. So I've just noticed they've always been fighting to be seen and to feel valued. And so there's some psychology there that may be something we need to look at more. And then ultimately, the fear of looking incompetent gives them anxiety, and they defend. And so again, I use Dr. Crawshaw's coaching, and coaching clients are often assigned to me because something's happened. So as I mentioned, something's been going on for a long time, and finally the organization gets slapped in the face. I've coached 2 individuals who actually caused a panic attack in an employee, and that was what got the organization to finally say, okay, we're interested in solving this. And so the process is to do a 360 interview with 10 to 15 people, and you collect all this data and you move it all into themes, and then you provide that to the coaching client. And so you can see before coaching, a lot of times themes are things like condescending tone, or doesn't like to be disagreed with, or my way or the highway. And after coaching, and Mercedes is probably my number one best case, she literally did a 180. Her feedback the second time around was literally 100% opposite. And she just had really taken in the coaching and made a big change, and she wanted to change. She didn't want to be seen that way. All right, so there is my contact information. I'm happy to send you anything you want based on what you've heard today. We do an e-newsletter where I talk a lot about, you know, things that we're doing and making sure that we're giving good information for creating positive work environments. So I've learned a lot from all of you, reading all of your articles and attending your presentation. So hopefully you got some nuggets from me.
All right, well, thank you very much, Catherine. That was absolutely amazing. And it's just wonderful to hear all of your experience and really to be able to link it to obviously what the researchers are doing, but hearing how you use the research, but then you adapt it for real life. And it's just fantastic. Your stories are marvelous. So thank you. And I love your enthusiasm. It's just, you're bubbling over. It's just amazing. So thank you very much indeed. It is a truly inspirational talk.
Thank you.
I'm sure everybody will agree with me. I really feel like I want to give you a round of applause, and we should be having a standing ovation for you. But thanks ever so much. It was really fantastic. And I'm sure people will be getting in touch with you to ask you more questions and to get more information. So,
I'd love to. I'd love to chat.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you very much. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to wind it up there because it's 2 minutes to the hour. So you can go and relax now, and you've achieved your keynote. So well done. All right. So thank you very much. Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.